was in a bit of a bind last year. They had Rourke, they had Adams, and Adams moves on to Calgary. They're 4-1 now. What can you say about his play with that team this season?
I'll tell you, the Calgary Stampeders must be looking at the stars going, what are the chances that when we bottomed out, and we're ready to retool the roster and change a bunch of the coaching staff and begin that rebuilding process and look for our next guy, that Vernon Adams is available. 31 years old, seasoned, proven. I mean, if it was anybody else but Nathan Rourke that with the opportunity to go to BC, Vernon Adams would still be their quarterback. And he's not just, a dynamic player and a guy who can do all kinds of things at his position. He's also a guy who sets culture. Everywhere Vernon Adams has been, he's been a leader. He's a guy who understands this league and kind of how to conduct himself off season, in season. I remember talking to Jalen Philpott, one of the Philpott twins, who was a free agent last year after starting 3 years with Calgary. And I was talking to him about, the decision to go back to the Stamps after, they kind of bottomed out last year. And it was clear he'd spent a lot of conversations in the offseason with Vernon Adams. I mean, Vernon Adams arrived in Calgary and not only became the starting quarterback, but he became, the leader of the team to retain guys. And it's been dramatic. The other thing they did was, Calgary the worst record in the league last year. So you get the first overall pick. Okay, getting the first overall pick in the CFL is not like getting the first overall pick in the NFL. You're still probably picking a developmental player. You're probably still picking a guy who's not going to have an impact on your roster, till maybe late in his rookie year, maybe even year two. Well, they took a guy named Damian Alford, who played most of his college career in Syracuse. He was at Utah last year, was hurt all year. He had, I think it was like 6 for 155 and 2 touchdowns on the weekend. Second straight game, he's had a touchdown. He's a 6'5", 6'6" guy out of Montreal. He can high point the ball. He's got speed. We don't usually see rookie Canadian receivers, splash like this in their first 2 months in the league. So, there are a few things going right in Calgary, but definitely Vernon Adams. It's such a luxury for a rebuilding team to be able to go out and find a player like that right in the heart of his prime and start to build around him.
With Dave Naylor, and obviously the reason he was available was because Nathan Rourke was on his way back to BC, and it didn't go well for Rourke last year, the transition after taking kicks at the can at the NFL and jumping around to a bunch of different spots in the NFL, obviously Jacksonville first and foremost. But the last few weeks he's looked pretty good. They just laid a beating on Struddy's Elks in his backyard in Edmonton, and he's very efficient in terms of throwing. He didn't have to run the ball because they were winning so big the other on Sunday night, I believe it was. But the previous few games, his legs look better. That's what he was right now, Gunn. Before he had that really tough injury a couple years ago, he was a dual threat with his arm, with his legs. He looks like he's pretty close to being back to form from my standpoint. Where do you stand on Nathan Rourke and him possibly getting back to that MOP status?
I very much agree with you, Brian. I think we saw it right in week number 1 in their first win against the Elks. And, then he has the injury the next couple of weeks. And, it's an oblique, so it's the kind of thing that takes some time to heal. And, he's taken practice in first team one day and then not the next. And that kind of in and out of the lineup thing he was working. But I thought he played very well in the game the other night. Look, I'm not surprised here. Nathan Rourke's 27 years old, so he's not a kid anymore. He's right in the heart of his prime. And look, when you come back from the National Football League in midseason, there's not much of a history of guys really coming back and lighting it up the second half of the year. There were 3 prominent players that came back from the NFL last year. Matthew Betts came back from the Detroit Lions, BC Lions last year, didn't have a great second half. Austin Mack came back from the Atlanta Falcons to Montreal, the receiver. He didn't have a great second half, and neither did Nathan Rourke. And look, I don't know this, but I'm going to speculate that Nathan Rourke's a kid who grew up in Oakville dreaming of playing in the National Football League. And, he got himself there. And once you get there in the kind of position he was in as a free agent coming out of the CFL, you need some things to break your way. It's just the way it is. If Brock Purdy hadn't had everybody fall down in front of him in San Francisco, we wouldn't know who he is. It's just they just don't make way for 7th-round picks or free agent quarterbacks. You kind of just need things to fall in your direction to get an opportunity. It never really did for Nathan. And look, I'm sure processing the end of that NFL dream, and I don't want to say it's over for him in the NFL, but the odds are unlikely that he ends up going back. It's just the longer you're here, the older you get, the less opportunity there is to make that jump. So I'm sure that was something that just emotionally was tough for him to process last year, but he's reset himself. I thought he looked kind of burned out at the end of last year, but he's really reset himself this offseason. The Lions are a bit of a work in progress, but I don't think Nathan Rourke is. I think, look, if he's the outstanding player at the end of this year, I will not be surprised at all. And I think he's going to have a very, good season and a long career in the CFL. He really looks like the guy that we saw in 2022 before he went to Jacksonville.
Dave, as you know, the Elks turned to some of their alumni to fill some important positions in their organization, including GM and president. Got a new coach. Everything's changed. Are you seeing enough traction this team is, going to maybe find a different path into the second half?
It's a bye week in Edmonton, and I think they got conversations about what to do on both sides of the ball. The Trey Ford thing, gets a lot of the attention, right? And just to put Trey Ford in context for people who don't understand it, Trey Ford played football at the University of Waterloo, okay? In the last 50 years, the number of U Sport quarterbacks who have been handed the keys to an offense, like not as a fill-in duty, but like, you're our guy out of the gate, number one, he's it. Like, there's nobody else. So, he's trying to do something that isn't done very often. He's, again, an athletically freakish player who can, make Lamar Jackson type plays at times, but he also can mess up simple plays. And that's been the variance that people have seen in Trey Ford. And I think there is a discussion in Edmonton about, looking at sort of what is his first 5 games of the season been. It was a big step backwards against BC. They got to win. You can't rebuild a fan base once you get to 1-6 or 1-7. You're talking about next year. So that's one conversation I think is being had, and the other is the defense. They went out and spent in relative terms, a boatload on their defense, and particularly the front 6 or 7. And they have given up the most points per game this season. They've given up the most yards per game this season, and they've given up the most passing yards this season. When you go out and spend the kind of money, they got a couple of defensive linemen that are making in excess of $250,000, which in CFL money is a lot for a defensive player, and it's just not getting it done. And I don't think that makes the assignment for Trey Ford any easier, because as a young quarterback, you don't want to put him in a position where you're chasing scores in the second half, and that's where they've been, most of the time.
With Dave Naylor, our TSN CFL NFL reporter and insider. Week 7 of the CFL beginning tonight. Argos in Montreal playing the Alouettes. So a big story that you broke this week. Sean Lemon has been reinstated by the CFL. Stuart Johnston, of course, the new commissioner in the CFL. And Lemon, famously was suspended indefinitely last April for wagering on CFL games. And he's not a young guy. He's, I believe, 36. He's a free agent now. So what does this mean now that he's been reinstated? Are you surprised at all that, what seemed like a lifetime ban actually was about 15, 16 months? And what kind of market is going to be out there for him?
Yeah, I would say when a soon-to-be 36-year-old defensive lineman gets suspended indefinitely, that's probably the end of his career. I would have told you that at the time. And, I think part of it was, he appealed his suspension, right? And the basis of his appeal, I believe, was essentially, I didn't know you couldn't do that. And
I didn't know you couldn't do that. Was that wrong? Was that wrong, me wagering on games?
or nobody formally told me you can't do that. That was essentially his argument, right?
What a case.
And he went and got independent representation for that. The CFLPA did not represent him in his appeal, which is pretty unusual for a guy to go outside the union and make that argument. So, look, I know the league office was not happy that he appealed, and maybe the fact that there's a new commissioner made this more possible. I think there was also a more contrite version of Sean Lemon in this case, taking counseling, accepting counseling, not talking about the arguments that he made, a year ago. But he lives in Montreal year-round. From my understanding, the Alouettes lobbied on his behalf in the background here. And they do have a degree of interest. I'm kind of surprised they haven't signed him, or we got a little while before we get to kickoff, because here's the other element of the story. He has a 2-game suspension for testing positive for a banned substance. So once he does
no one told him that was illegal, though, Dave. No, to be fair to Sean, he wasn't aware that he couldn't do that.
Anyway, if they sign him in about the next hour, I think they can work off one of his 2-game suspensions tonight.
Right.
But he'll be on the practice roster a few weeks anyway. But look, I think it comes down to precedent, right? If you look at other leagues, he didn't bet against his team. He bet on his team. It was, I think, one parlay ticket where he played like a Hamilton Tiger Cat money line and a Calgary Stampeder +6 for like $100 Canadian on an offshore. So it wasn't like he wasn't throwing games. He didn't have 10 grand on the game. You still can't do it.
Right.
But, ultimately, the league didn't decide it was worth, a lifetime ban.
Okay. And listen, this is sticky. Like the integrity of the sport stuff is sticky because everyone's in bed with gambling. Gambling's legal now, at least in the province of Ontario. And I think we all know it's going to be a ripple effect throughout the country at some point. And it certainly is down in the States. So it's a very different world than it used to be. Yet I think if anything, more than ever, you probably have to be that much more diligent, right, Dave? Because now, people that aren't gambling are really looking at this, wondering what's going on in the sports world. Right? It's a different complexion today than it was 10 years ago.
Well, absolutely. And to that point about diligence, and listen, this is a real mystery around the CFL. I've had people from teams call me and say, do you know how they caught him? And I mean, not to tell me, but to ask me. Because here's the thing. Sean Lemon placed that bet with an offshore.
Right. Not
with a licensed book.
Right.
Right? So you would think, okay, if I find a book somewhere in Asia and place a parlay ticket or Europe, and because I believe the currency that he bet in was euros, so it would have been in Europe somewhere. He bet one parlay ticket on a tie cat and a stamp game, and the league found it.